emergency for the first time in about...
This is Jim, and
Receiving this message. We are Ken Jennings and John Roderick. We speak to you from our present, which we can only assume is your distant past, the turbulent time that was the early 21st century.
Fearing the great cataclysm that will surely befall our civilization, we began this monumental reference of strange and obscure human knowledge. These recordings represent our attempt to compile and preserve wonders and esoterica that would otherwise be lost.
So whether you're listening from an advanced civilization or have just reinvented the technology to decrypt our transmissions, this is our legacy to you.
This is our time capsule. This is the Omnibus.
You have accessed entry 554.EX2320, certificate number 25639. The Guardian Angels.
And the criminals would take the streets and take the communities like zombies in Dawn of the Dead, roaming about, crack-crazed cretins with chromosome damage.
You sound kind of husky.
I just cleared my throat right before we started, but it was like, I should have gone a little longer. I was doing my sexy intro.
Hi there.
Hey, late night listeners.
It's Ken Jennings.
Wolfman Ken here.
We're going to talk a little bit about some drive time radio on this show. I wonder, what do you think our show would be like if you and I were just like AM radio jocks? Is there left-wing talk radio?
Kind of. Not really.
We're not really
right?
left-wingers.
All the attempts at it fail.
Because left-wingers are angrier at no one more than themselves?
I guess. They're harder to gin up a rage. I mean,
Yeah.
maybe they have NPR. They're perfectly happy.
Oh,
so if
sure.
you try to give them Air America, if you try to give them, Janine Garofalo or Lawrence O'Donnell yelling at conservatives, they just by
Doesn't
temperament,
scratch the itch.
they don't want it.
Yeah, they'd rather hear Lake Wobegon.
And also they have all, liberals have all media.
Sure, of course. Of course.
Like if you want snarky takes on the news from the left, boy, I wonder where you'd find that.
Where would I go? What was the first time you visited New York City?
I was in college, and it was the late 90s. So it wasn't yet
Pretty late.
post 9/11 New York. I saw the World Trade Center from the Staten Island Ferry, but it was pretty late. It was nothing like New York in the movies I was watching, Midnight Cowboy and so forth.
And what was your impression? I guess, what was your expectation, and then what was your impression?
I don't know if I remember.
I mean, did you expect to see Snake Plissken roaming the streets?
I think I knew that it was, I had grown up in big world cities. Like, Hong Kong or Tokyo, they're just as overwhelming as New York in their way.
Right.
I remember the canyons of Fifth Avenue or Park Avenue, looking like they do in Spider-Man comic books or whatever. And I liked that. And I was happy to sit and gawk at stuff like that, even though I knew that makes you a rube in New York.
Uh-huh.
But you've seen so many movies set there. New York's not really going to surprise you. I feel like nothing about it surprised me. Maybe it was smellier than I thought, but then Letterman had told me about that too.
It's pretty smelly.
Yeah, everybody had hooked me up. Like the culture had prepared me for New York.
But you weren't scared.
No, for one thing, it wasn't scary.
But were you intimidated?
No, I'd seen it all. The crowds, the noise. You mean like the prospect of a mugging or something?
Yeah, that New York would be more dangerous than Tokyo or Berlin or Seoul.
No, I think
because of something intrinsically New York about it.
No, I think I knew that it was not a scary time in New York. And my priors were, unless you're in a really dodgy part of town or empty park at 2 a.m., you really don't have to worry about crime in cities. It's, I think you have to be pretty isolated now to think that you're going to have your wallet stolen or backpack grabbed within 5 minutes of getting out of the Port Authority bus terminal now. But I mean, I think people know that's not true.
Although we are kind of seeing a real rise in the idea that cities are lawless places. It's just now, rather than it being pickpockets and warriors style mugger gangs, it's now that the cities are full of Antifa terrorists who are making it unsafe to be a federal narc.
Yeah, I think we've all had if you live in a big city this year, you've probably had the experience of relatives texting you worried about something they just saw happening in your city.
Yeah. Portland is only 3 hours away. Are you safe?
I would like to be farther from Portland, but not because of Antifa.
Right. The idea, particularly in the most of the continental United States by area, that cities are dangerous, lawless places full of weirdos and punks
It's true. I mean, they're full of weirdos.
They are full of weirdos.
They're just not that dangerous.
Not anymore.
But
in the 1960s and 70s, American cities and cities kind of globally had some growing pains. It was a time where what the city's personalities were, what the approach to crime and changing economics. I mean, all that stuff was still really up in the air.
And there was still lead in the paint, as we've discussed on Omnibus before.
Lead in the gas.
Yeah, exactly. Lead everywhere.
There was lead everywhere, and that was affecting people's moods.
Dairy Queen had a lead blizzard. It was a strange time.
But in the 1970s in particular, like you've surely heard here in Seattle the billboard that said, "Will the last person leaving Seattle please turn out the lights?"
Due to the Boeing layoffs and the shrinking of the city.
It's one of those things that every old Seattle mom, finds a way to reference every few months in kind of trying to describe Seattle's progress over time.
That's a very Seattle specific thing, but was that kind of true of the era in general? The American cities were dying in a way that people thought they'd be empty?
Different cities for different reasons, right? The Rust Belt cities, which had in the mid-century and early part of the 20th century been some of the most gilded and prosperous cities in the world, Detroit and Buffalo and Cleveland.
Centers of industry.
These were cities with just tremendous wealth and growing populations. Those were all in decline for various reasons having to do with the sort of wholesale flight of manufacturing overseas and the fact that you can argue what produced the Rust Belt, and maybe we should here on the Omnibus program.
Should we argue about what produced the Rust Belt?
But not this episode. But those cities were in decline, and the white flight phenomenon of people moving to the suburbs and leaving inner cities initially because they wanted to have big backyards and exclusive schools, and then as cities became less and less full of white people, then there was more and more desire of a certain class of white people to get out.
And maybe saying exclusive schools is just another way of saying a lot of these things in the first place, right?
Yeah, well, and I mean, you're building new communities out there, and so the schools have new chalkboards or whatever. But yeah,
But also,
it's a.
They have other people that look like you.
White flight was a thing that recapitulated itself, right? And a lot of that had to do with in many cities fallout from the kind of wanton urban revitalization or urban renewal, quote unquote, and the construction of the interstate highway system.
So just badly done urban renewal, or urban renewal just as a code word for
destroying
actual communities. Yeah.
But cities like New York, New York went bankrupt in the 1970s, and there was a kind of like a general consensus that the city was, that maybe the city itself wouldn't survive.
Yeah, New York is done as a international center of everything.
Yeah, if it entered into a death spiral where it couldn't, where in a state of bankruptcy it couldn't pay normal operating expenses, like how would you ever recover from that, right? And people were fleeing the city in droves, and the police were kind of abdicating their responsibility. There was corruption was endemic. It really felt, and being a kid in the 1970s and kind of reading about it in the at a great distance
in Newsweek,
just imagining America in the 1970s and kind of the inevitable feeling at the time, probably, that these were, you always in the moment feel like the problems you're experiencing are unarrestable. We're certainly seeing that with the climate change now. We just can't imagine that there's a solution. It seems like we're over a threshold and plummeting to an inevitable conclusion. And that was the feeling of the kind of decline of America in the 70s. How is New York going to recover from a bankruptcy and restore civic order and clean up the rats and the, feces in the streets? Like, how is it ever going to be habitable again? It just didn't seem conceivable. And I don't think anybody would have predicted it would once again become the most expensive city in the world. And, and that Times Square would be
such that this period you're talking about seems like an almost unimaginable blip. Like today it would be easy to assume there's this continuity of New York power going all the way back to the Jazz Age.
Right.
And not that it was interrupted by a time when it seemed like that was all over.
And as it declined, a feeling in sort of the predictable corners of the United States that are always sort of tilted against a New York City, a kind of a barely suppressed glee that
they had it coming.
Yeah, that there was instant karma in effect. That New York, full of debauchery.
That's what you get for having all those drug addicts and queers and Puerto Ricans.
Yeah,
I guess.
Puerto Ricans and Jews. I mean, that's the city. The city could only but fail. And during this era, it's kind of difficult to have watched this from afar and square it with the fact that New York was still a cultural capital, and in many ways, maybe the cultural capital. Right? These are the heydays of disco and Woody Allen and
theater and publishing continue unabated.
Right. Great writing. New York in the 70s is, now we look back at it and kind of erase all that fear and all that doom and gloom and just think, oh, right, like John Lennon was living there and like what a fun time. Lou Reed. But
I guess it depends on what part of town you're in.
Right. Well,
or what time of day.
What time of day and what your, like everything, what your access was, but also what you were prepared to endure. And I think people that lived in New York then as now get used to enduring things that other people would find kind of more difficult. And nowadays, it's just, are you willing to take 45 minutes to get anywhere?
Yeah. How awful a subway ride are you prepared for?
But in the 70s, the question of how awful a subway ride you were prepared for had a very different meaning.
Right.
The subways were, by all accounts, full of violent crime, a palpably unsafe feeling, dirty. We have romanticized that era too, because that's the dawn of hip hop and graffiti and they're kind of colorful versions of that time.
Some of those trains do look great.
Yeah, they
don't get me wrong.
But at the time,
you don't want to get knifed on them.
That graffiti was seen as endemic of just a lawlessness,
city spiraling out of control.
Yeah, and the kind of Curtis Blow fun version of it that has made it into the history books, I don't think was true for anyone, not the commuter or Curtis Blow himself. But and this is also the era of the Bronx becoming essentially a place where the community burned night after night. That really it became a kind of lawless part of New York. The police were not able to maintain order, and
it's not that different than how we perceive American cities, or the inevitable decline of America today, I guess, which is hopeful.
yeah,
I mean, because you can see that some of these problems did solve themselves over not that much period of time. I mean, partly through natural processes. If urban cores hollow out and rents go down, at some point, white flight reverses.
yeah, and that of course isn't inevitable and wasn't anticipated. But the idea that you could go down into New York and start a dance troupe and just kind of take over a 8,000 square foot loft and just run around in leg warmers wasn't what anybody expected to happen in 1974. But it made for some pretty good TV in 1984.
Thank goodness.
Yeah, I'll say.
We never would have had fame without it.
And when you think about Seattle in 1994, we had access to all the abandoned warehouses you could possibly ask for.
Places to show your work, or for your band to rehearse, and you saw the cultural renaissance that came out of it.
And we thought at the time that that all this blight was a product of a city in decline. That Seattle, how do you recover from it? It wasn't even really clear to us then, and you couldn't have predicted how it would happen.
But there were, I wonder if there are New York analogs to the Seattle phenomenon of people essentially voting for the blight. I don't want these big tech billionaires to come in here and try urban revitalization. We like our gritty Seattle.
We like our blight.
And as a result, we did not get a $1 billion Paul Allen improvement project that we could have.
Well, there in New York, it was always a question of law and order. Some basic government, basic questions of who's governing and how. And Rudy Giuliani, who has become like a cartoonish buffoon in his later life.
Who has squandered more goodwill ever than Rudy Giuliani?
In the early 80s was a sharp and articulate, moderate but tough on crime public prosecutor who was going to sweep into New York and change the way business got done. And that's another topic for a future omnibus, the broken windows theory of crime and Rudy Giuliani's cleanup of New York. But and whatever you attribute it to, it is true that New York in 1984 and New York in 1994 were markedly different places, entirely different experiences.
And I remember there were the New Yorkers bemoaning it. Right?
Well, sure.
These chain restaurants in Times Square, those should be porno theaters.
And Times Square, when it was full of porno theaters, was terrifying. I mean, it was not just terrifying to look at out of a cab, but terrifying to walk down the street.
But a great place to get a fake ID.
It was a great place to get a fake ID, and it was a great place to see porn in 35 millimeter, which you can't do anymore.
You're such a cineast.
Or 70 millimeter porn.
I don't think 70 millimeter porn is a thing.
But
terrifying.
And there was that period in between when Times Square was no longer terrifying, but had not yet become grotesque.
A theme park.
Yeah, where you saw the cleanup happening and kind of couldn't help but give a little bit of a slow clap, like, oh, okay, so it didn't have to be quite that bad.
But I do remember New Yorkers just showing their tough, hard-bitten New York souls by saying, like, there shouldn't be a Disney store there.
Well, there shouldn't, frankly. But now, that ship sailed so long ago, there's a whole generation of fully fledged grown-ups who never remember a time.
Think about how Times Square is, if you've seen The Office, Times Square is now a signifier for, kind of a hokey tourist strip mall in the middle of a cool place, which could not be more different than how it was a comedy signifier 20 years before.
So during that period, that lawless period in the late 70s, and it wasn't lawless by any means, but when the police become overwhelmed and when they
other social welfare systems pushed well past their breaking point.
Right. The communities that start to suffer first are of course, the poorest ones and the ones that have, the police will, as they will shrink into a cordon around
the Upper West Side.
Yeah, right. Around the neighborhoods that have the most vocal and connected, like defenders and supporters.
Still happens today.
And so if you were a resident of New York City who lived in the Bronx or in Brooklyn or in any part of the community that wasn't already an enclave, you not only were facing a city in bankruptcy and without, just in general where services were starting to fray, but you were on the front lines of that experience. And the feeling, I think, from the outside looking at those communities is always that it's a community problem, it's not our problem, right? Or it's not the city's problem. It's not the police's fault. It's the decline of the American family, or it's the decline of Western civilization. But from within the community, of course, people are just trying to go about their daily lives and stunned at the lack of institutional. I mean, like newly surprised with every passing day. Even the most cynical person surprised at how completely a city or an administration can abandon them.
Yeah.
And in the case of late 70s New York, there was a young man by the name of Curtis Sliwa, who was a Roman Catholic kind of local boy who showed a lot of promise, but had kind of become he'd gotten expelled from high school expelled from his Catholic high school for being a little bit of an agitator.
What neighborhood? Where's this guy from?
So Curtis grew up in Canarsie, which is a part of Brooklyn over by Jamaica Bay, like further out than Flatbush, which in the 40s and 50s would have been a neighborhood full of Italians and an immigrant.
He looks Italian, but Sliwa doesn't sound Italian.
He's half Italian and half, I guess his mother was Italian and his father was Polish.
I guess that makes sense. It was probably...
But Roman Catholics.
Slivovsky or something, yes.
Right. And he went to Jesuit school, and he was a sort of typical New York kid of the 60s. But like I say, got expelled from high school and sort of didn't end up, I guess, flourishing in the sense that he didn't go to Dartmouth. But he did flourish in the sense that he was the night manager of a McDonald's in the Bronx.
So, working guy.
Yeah,
supporting whatever his household was.
A working guy, and a guy that I think probably felt a connection to like blue collar New York, which and this is the other thing that's very hard for us to imagine now, but that New York was a majority blue collar city, thought of itself as a working class city, that the rich and the cultural elite were confined to the upper Manhattan.
Yeah, and the tiny finance ghetto, and everybody else is
just working for a living,
packing meat or sewing undershirts or something.
Yeah, right. It was New York was a manufacturing center. It was a shipping center, and not a place full of people with lofty ambition. But Sliwa, in working at this McDonald's, was face to face with just public violence, public sort of lawlessness, subways that were dangerous to the degree that even in the middle of the day, in the middle of the week, you'd be afraid to go down there. And as you know, the subways in New York are not really optional for most people, right? It's the
only way to get around.
It's the only way to get around. And so, people were getting mugged and beaten on the regular. And Curtis decided, in a way that feels almost instinctual, for a certain kind of young dude, that he and his friends were going to get together and they were going to form effectively a vigilante group that were going to protect the neighborhood by way of just sort of making themselves a presence on public transit.
There's a spectrum of vigilantehood that ends with, some guy in a superhero outfit and body armor and an open carrying. But there's also, it's normal for community groups to form where neighbors, keep an eye out, sponsor neighborhood watches. I mean, how crazy is this idea on the scale of one to the Punisher?
Neighborhood watches actually date back to the early 60s. And
same time period? Is it like scared white flight suburbanites?
10 years before, but the notion that communities look out for themselves. I mean, as we've talked about on the show before, policing,
it's not inevitable.
Policing is a fairly recent invention, right? In the idea, in the sense of it being like an agent of state power. Policing was, throughout most of history, a community-based sort of a consensual enforcement of community standards. But I think in New York in particular, and nationwide, the galvanizing effect of the murder of Kitty Genovese in 1964. She was a young woman in Queens who was knifed and murdered over the course of a long period of time, screaming for help.
It became kind of an inaccurate case study of what's called the bystander effect, where responsibility dilutes with the number of people, available to help out with something, such that sometimes you don't get the kinds of interventions you need. Right.
She's screaming for help, and dozens of people are turning up the volume on their television sets, assuming someone else is going to come to her aid. And
I assume it's somewhat the idea we have that came out about her case in the 80s and 90s of kind of jaded New Yorkers staring out this window and watching somebody get assaulted and knifed. I guess that's not really true.
Right.
Like the lack of intervention in her case was a lot more understandable than we have come to hear.
But it did like in so many instances where one event ends up standing in for what is perceived to be an entire perceived to be an epidemic.
Endemic problem, yeah.
She became a watchword for this this idea that we had stopped caring for one another, that we had stopped bearing a shared responsibility for the quality of our cities and our towns. And
also that as a result, they were literally coming for us.
Right. Zombie gangsters. I mean, the movie The Warriors actually came out right around the time that Curtis Sliwa started his little vigilante group. And the Warriors were promoting this notion that there were like gangs roaming the streets of New York, effectively enforcing neighborhood law, fighting stick fights with one another in abandoned lots. It's a New York that it's a very colorful New York. One you almost prefer to the Disney
I was about to say you seem nostalgic for this world that never was.
Well, I also looked for Snake Plissken the first time I went to New York, but I went in the 80s and New York was still...
He might have been there.
Yeah, I think he was. He was hiding out. But Sliwa and his friends started to ride the subways, and with an ethos that they would not carry weapons, that they were not going to be they weren't going to resort to violence. They were going to practice a kind of 70s... They knew some judo moves that they learned from
watching Enter the Dragon.
Yeah, Enter the Dragon moves. But otherwise, they were going to practice kind of conflict de-escalation. But more than anything, just the fact that they would be present and bear witness and be prepared to intervene.
And you have to be recognizable in this kind of scenario.
So Sliwa's original group was called the Magnificent 13, but after he had about 50 people in his Magnificent 13.
You can't keep changing the name. It's like when the U.S. decided they couldn't just keep adding stripes to the flag.
they decided we're the United States, not
You get a pinstripe flag if you keep doing that.
the 13 states that matter, and then all y'all.
Right. It's annoying. Rhode Island is a stripe and I'm not. Texas isn't.
I mean, you know what? That's the great thing about America. Any one of those stripes can be your stripe.
Every state right now gets about like 3.8,
3/8 of a stripe?
Yeah, a little less, I guess.
Huh.
Each stripe is 3.8 states.
What do you think is the Washington 3.8?
Well, I mean, it depends. Do they move to the lower right of the flag? Are you reading it up? Like, is the bottom half of the lowest red stripe Alaska and Hawaii?
It must be.
Because if so, we're below the blue standard. But it also means the early states get shorter stripes.
Yeah.
'Cause the first 6 stripes are like half the width,
Yeah. Screw you, early states.
and they're tiny.
We get the big fat stripe.
Because we're the big West.
Although, wait a minute. If you're gauging it by stripe width but not length, but if you take the overall area of the flag that is stripes and divide that area up,
Yeah, it's true.
then you're going to have...
So maybe that's what you would have to do.
Yeah, the smaller states are going to have more of those small...
I like to keep them at the beginning. There's like, would there be any even big states in the first? Yeah, maybe.
What's the biggest state of the original states?
Well, I mean,
Pennsylvania? New York.
The first 20 to 24 of the states are going to be in the half stripes, and I don't think that gets you Texas. It's close. Yeah, I don't think it gets you Texas.
Yeah, right. So
it's okay. Yeah, it would be nothing bigger than Pennsylvania. You're right. Ohio, maybe.
No, Ohio's not bigger than Pennsylvania.
Is New York bigger than Pennsylvania?
I think so. Isn't it? What's the land area of what's the land speed of a European swallow, an unladen swallow?
Okay, here are the answers to all our questions. Pennsylvania is slightly bigger than Ohio. They are the 33rd and 34th biggest state, but New York and North Carolina are bigger than either. New York is the 27th biggest state. Virginia would have been bigger at the time, of course, when it still had West Virginia in it.
Right.
But now it doesn't. And in terms of how quickly they entered the Union...
So Virginia was the largest state in the original 13 colonies.
That seems right, just because of the...
Right.
Before it got sawed in half.
Well, and especially since it went all the way to the Pacific Ocean.
Right. Yeah, I think there, by some reckoning, isn't what's today Minnesota part of Virginia?
Yeah,
As far as Virginia was drawn on old maps. Texas was the 28th state.
Oh, so just down into the big stripes.
It would not have to be in one of the small stripes, I think, if my math is right.
The Magnificent 13 changed their name to the Guardian Angels in 1979, and they got a distinctive uniform, a distinctive and inexpensive uniform of a T-shirt with a cool logo on it. A cool logo which is basically just the Masonic pyramid with the all-seeing eye and some...
But it's more like we are watching you than wisdom or anything.
Yeah, we're like we are watching out.
I mean, Neighborhood Watch to this day often has an eye in its logo.
Yeah, Neighborhood Watch often has that character it's actually called Boris the Burglar. The little
the guy sneaking around.
Yeah, who kind of looks like
Boris
and Natasha.
He looks like he's going to steal my Cookie Crisp.
Yeah, it's Boris the Burglar.
Oh, by the way, I'm gonna hear about this if I don't. There are actually 7 small stripes and 6 large ones, not the other way around.
Oh,
so Texas probably would have to be a small stripe. All right, please continue your story of
Texas,
the Masonic symbol.
But the most recognizable part of the Guardian Angels uniform was the red beret, and it was a time I think when the red beret is a pretty bold statement.
It connotes a real paramilitary vibe.
Yeah.
Right?
And this is pre like S1Ws, the kind of like the militarization of hip hop that happened a little bit later, and maybe
as a result. Yeah, I would think so. Because you would see these guys, you're trying to get into your building in New York in the early 80s or whatever, and here's some guy in a kind of a members only jacket and matching beret. And have you seen this? The berets often had paraphernalia. Sometimes they'd have like little raccoon tails or beads hanging off them. I don't know if that is how many Cookie Crisp burglars you put away or whatever.
Yeah, there's a lot of flair that goes with the uniforms. And now if you see, because Guardian Angels still exist, if you see them now, they're their berets are often bedecked with pins and buttons and other.
It's because they're serving
awards.
they're waiting tables at Chili's after their shift on the subway.
But in the early days, the paramilitary vibe and the kind of the gangbanger vibe of it, like the uniforms weren't, beyond the t-shirt and the beret, they weren't standardized. Some guys were wearing like studded leather wristbands, and some of them had, like lots of cool inner city flair, suspenders and parachute pants. But it was an all volunteer organization, and it was all young people from the communities, men and women, who underwent some minimal amount of training in conflict resolution and in like you were saying, Enter the Dragon style jiu-jitsu.
And we're picturing like blue collar white dads, just like Catholic guys with mustaches.
No, most of them kids directly from the Bronx, inner city kids, an incredibly diverse complexion to the original members. Most of them actually people of color, who were, So it happened very quickly that it wasn't just Curtis and his drinking buddies. It very quickly reached into the younger levels of the community. Curtis was living in the Bronx and working at this McDonald's, and his original Magnificent 13 weren't a bunch of Italian guys from Canarsie.
I was picturing it wrong.
No, they were, they were like black kids just out of their teens who were, and there was always a kind of striking photo opportunity that Curtis would kind of stand in the front of his soldiers, and he didn't structure it that way. He didn't call himself the general.
He didn't have
whatever,
a riding crop,
but he did wear a tie often, and everybody else was kind of in their in like flash dance style. I mean, they're extremely cool looking by conventional standards. If you look back at the 1970s and these cats who were taking over where they felt the police had left off.
Too bad it didn't catch on. Too bad nobody ever tried this out on the runway in Milan.
Well, what happened was the police and the like mainstream administration in New York did not like this idea at all. And you can kind of see why.
Is it the good, what we would think of as the good progressive case against vigilantism, or the bad corrupt law enforcement case against vigilantism?
Much more the latter, in the sense that they felt like they were both encroaching on, the argument was, this is the police job. This is the police's job to do what you're doing.
It makes us look bad that guys in red hats are doing it.
Right. And then the guardian angels would reply, well, sure, but you're not doing it. And so somebody has to. And the guardian angels were not implicated in what you think of as the danger of vigilantism in that they weren't, because they had a prohibition on carrying weapons, and they actually search one another before going on patrol. Like they all meet to go ride.
I think I've seen that, but I got the wrong idea.
They're going to go ride the F train.
They're all standing in a circle, rubbing each other's legs.
And they're like, "Are you sure? Make sure you're not carrying a knife," because they wanted to be be sure that it didn't escalate in that way. And what they did was they'd wait in a subway stop. The train would pull in, and a different angel would get on each car, and so you had guardian angels throughout the train, and at each stop they would all kind of step onto the platform from their respective cars and check in with each other. And the idea being that if any guardian angel didn't come out of their car, that meant that they were in trouble, and that the others would all converge on whatever car it was that a person didn't appear.
So it's a show of force. It's there's no car on this train that's safe right now.
Yeah, it's or there's no car that's unsafe.
Sorry, that's safe. That's safe for you, the evildoer.
Right.
I'm sorry. I'm speaking as Batman here.
And it's the idea of sort of collective watchful action. That what's not going to happen on this train is that you just get away with something because no one's ready to stand up to you. Whether or not the guardian angels are capable of taking down a masked, armed cat burglar or not, most crimes of opportunity are going to be suppressed when you're in an environment where there's somebody standing there with their arms folded wearing a red beret going,
It might be a genie.
there's 9 other genies on this train. Maybe you want to mess with me, but do you want to mess with us all? But the police didn't like it, and the idea of and they started to really hassle the guardian angels, and it was a bad optic because the guardian angels were much more. They looked like the neighborhoods they were patrolling, where the NYPD did not.
They were the dads in mustaches,
right? So you've got young black kids who are concerned about violence on the subways, and the white cops from Staten Island don't like the look of it, and they arrested Curtis multiple times over the course of these early years. And to his discredit,
if he's not armed, what's the charge even? Unauthorized possession of a beret.
Yeah, just being, you can they made the case that the Guardian Angels were a gang, that they were, because this was an era where protection rackets and extortion and the threat of violence was really threaded through the whole culture of New York. And so not much of a leap to make the accusation that the Guardian Angels had to have been benefiting from a kind of, there had to be graft involved, right? I mean, that's the only way the NYPD could have seen it.
What did New Yorkers think?
Well, it depended on who you asked. And this was a time when the iconic character of the New York vigilante also started to take over the popular imagination.
Well, this is all still pre-Bernie Getz, right?
It's pre-Bernie Getz, but but that's in the air.
The people are mad as hell, and they're not going to take it anymore.
People have to take the law into their own hands, and depending on what part of New York you lived in, maybe you thought the greater threat was the Guardian Angels than the muggers on the subway. And again, we see it with Black Lives Matter and Antifa now. There are people in the city who feel like Black Lives Matter and Antifa are there to protect them from abusive police. And there are people who share the city with them who feel like Black Lives Matter and Antifa are there.
Are the trouble.
Yeah, they are the agents of destruction, and it's only the police that are keeping them from, I don't know what, burning the city to the ground or stealing all of Grandma's china.
I'm sure you have a galaxy brain take that supersedes both views.
Well, of course, because I'm a giant blue penis man that can see, centuries into the future.
Four-dimensionally.
Yeah, I'm not like,
I have a list of which Antifa
world.
are good and which Antifa are bad. All the Proud Boys are bad, however.
Sliwa discredited himself in those early days by actually, because he felt like the crimes that they were stopping and the harassment they were receiving went underreported, undocumented, he actually set up a couple of fake busts where his crew nabbed a perp, but it was staged. And then, to his everlasting shame, had himself kidnapped by a friend and dropped out in Canarsie or whatever.
This just escalated to 11 really fast.
Yeah.
Fake kidnapping.
And then he claimed that he'd been kidnapped by some cops who were shaking him down. And when he was busted for it, he said, I did these things and I'm really embarrassed, but I was trying to illustrate what our reality is day in and day out.
I'm speaking to a deeper truth with my lies.
Well, that's right.
I'm never a fan of that argument.
It's a terrible argument, and it discredited him, and it made it seem that one of the problems with the optics of the Guardian Angels is they always are right on the edge of seeming a little bit like a cult of personality. A little bit.
Well, the outfit and the uniform and the Masonic symbol don't help.
Yeah, it's. I think if you're on a subway and there's somebody on there swinging a big chain and chewing on a toothpick and staring at you, and a guardian angel walks on the train, you're probably grateful they're there. But in general, if you're just reading about them in the newspaper, you'd maybe rather that work be done better
by someone with actual accountability.
Yeah, by trained professionals.
Yeah, and training.
Sliwa became a public figure in New York, kind of in the same era and in the same way that Donald Trump initially did, where New York was capable of generating these national figures who were just clowning New Yorkers.
like clownish Donald Trump, he also, and I did not know this until I just read this old magazine profile, was also married to a model who like appeared on, kind of a Lower East Side Vanna White, who appeared on Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous and so forth.
Well, and Sliwa has been married a few times, and that stuff isn't to his credit either.
His Wikipedia entry has the rare for the 20th century unknown wife entry. Please, Curtis Sliwa's first wife, if you are listening to this in whatever era, please let us know.
Please touch in with us.
Please blink if you're all right.
His wife Lisa was like a stunning 6 foot tall black belt in karate, who was also national director of the Guardian Angels and has become a media personality in her own right.
Wow. Take that, Marla Maples.
Yeah, kapow. But the Guardian Angels far exceeded their actual reach culturally in the early 80s.
You mean their numbers did not live up to their
Yeah, we talked about
influence?
them in Alaska, and the idea, the idea that the Guardian Angels, just in the same way that why was anybody talking about Donald Trump that wasn't actively in part of a renters group?
Do you cheer for a Buffalo USFL team? If not, shut up.
But the Guardian Angels made many attempts to expand around the country and around the world, and in fact,
there were chapters in different cities.
There are now. There are active Guardian Angels in over 82 cities.
I don't know. I think I've seen one someplace I didn't expect. I think I've seen a Guardian Angel and not in New York, and I was like, "Is this still a thing?" Have you ever seen one?
I have. I've seen them. I've seen them multiple times. I'm always thrilled when I see one. I always go up and talk to them.
It's like seeing a DeLorean or something.
Yeah, and they're always delightful. I mean, they're always happy to talk, and
now they're kind of goodwill ambassadors from the 80s.
Yeah, sort of. But they're still doing that
it's
job.
like the Noid.
And they've just recently, like, they have an organization that defends animals. They have an animal rights Guardian Angels,
like against animal cruelty.
Yeah, and now they have, in response to the Me Too movement, there was kind of a growing recognition that a lot of the crime that happened on New York City subways was actually sex crime. Harassment, pervert behavior.
Flashing, groping.
They have now a pervert squad, which
is not made up of perverts, just to be clear.
No, let's hope not. But, all people made up entirely of people that identify as women or as, gender neutral or women identified,
gender neutral or above,
who go out and do the same Guardian Angel act, except looking for creeps, and it seems to be very effective. It's certainly a very effective optic.
Yeah, it's smart to kind of stay ahead of what the culture cares about. If vigilantism is getting a bad name because of Bernie Goetz or somebody else in the headlines, let's pivot to people chaining up their dogs.
Yeah, you see a lot fewer switchblades and a lot more upskirt camera pics these days. Like, what's the greater threat to civil society?
If I saw somebody open a switchblade, I think I would honestly think like, are you a time traveler?
Right? Wouldn't you crowd around and be like, "Oh, do it again, show me that"?
I used to have my friend had a butterfly knife, but then his mom found out. Now, and let me ask you this: I feel like a reason for all the media coverage is that it kind of, at the time at least, is that it flattered Middle America's idea of New York as a lawless wasteland, right? Like, they even need these. I mean, even though these guys seem ridiculous, this is what it takes. This is how bad New York is.
Well, again, we're watching vigilantism on the rise in the United States right now.
You just said vigilante once, but you didn't stick with it. I want you to stick with vigilante.
Vigilantism?
You said it once.
Okay, let's do vigilantism.
It rhymes with full Monty now.
We're seeing a rise in vigilantism, and it is it really depends where you fall. And we're living in an incredibly divided society now.
And things are changing very fast, so who knows what this is going to sound like in 1 year, much less 1,000.
That's right. And we've got effectively opposing bands that in any other time would be considered gangs, who are fighting for control of America's cities in a weird way.
You don't consider the Boogaloo guys and the Black Bloc to be gangs?
I don't think of them in those terms, but I don't see it. I mean, there's no reason not to. We're watching public opinion in the United States, deciding which lawless gang or which gotta
have a good guy.
Which gang working on the fringe of the law is going to be the one that whose aims you ultimately support. I think that.
Well, who else are you going to root for?
The sports ball?
Sports is having troubles. The police are doing no favors for themselves and winning fans.
I still root for the State Department and the Foreign Service, but I'm really alone in that.
I only root for the Parks Department and public radio. National Park System and public radio. That's it.
Well, speaking of radio, Sliwa translated, or he pivoted in the during this period. He pivoted into broadcasting.
Yes, Curtis, get that paper.
He got a radio show. He got a radio show on WABC in New York, and maybe not surprisingly, this is what made it sort of culturally complicated, was that the Guardian Angels were almost entirely kids of color, protecting people of color in
their own neighborhoods.
In their own neighborhoods. But Curtis has a very sort of law and order mentality. A law and order mentality that when it translates to talk radio is sort of, very quickly verged over into being just regular old law and order talk.
Well, especially if that's where the money is. If the talk radio shows that are successful are ones where people say outrageous opinions to stoke conservative rage, I mean, that's what you're going to tend to, even if that's not how you came up.
And Sliwa, by all accounts, is sort of an old school reactionary conservative. It gradually became more conservative, but he remains on the radio to this day.
Oh, like people in New York you might see his picture on a bus.
You do, and when Giuliani became the mayor, he kind of tried to co-opt some of Sliwa's law and order vibe because the Guardian Angels had become a kind of they'd been accepted by New York,
a friendly face on this issue.
Yeah, and so Giuliani was like, "Oh, well, maybe we can work together to make New York, a safer place." And Sliwa became a charismatic figure. And there is, I think, in every community, a sense that restoring law and order is colorblind. That there are what we would think of as conservative pro-police attitudes in any community you go to, and a lot of it has to do with have you recently been the victim of violent crime?
Even in communities where they very much distrust the police, you interview the residents of those neighborhoods, and absolutely their number one concern is safety on their streets.
Right.
They just feel like they don't trust any of the forces that could offer it.
And in the 80s, there was a lot of recruitment by the NYPD in Puerto Rican, Dominican, and Black communities to diversify the police force. So as the city became less and less working class, the police remained a kind of working class opportunity for a lot of communities of color. So the confusion of what you think of as the classic conflict between the police and communities of color was really scrambled in the Guardian Angels. And
it's really interesting.
Sliwa, who always positioned himself as somebody that thought Donald Trump was a crank, because they're New York personality figureheads during the whole same period.
It's Queens versus Bronx and Brooklyn.
Yeah. And Sliwa had, just thought Trump was a screwball. There's actually some stuff on the web suggesting that Donald Trump considered appointing Curtis as the Secretary of Defense, although I have not been able. There are like 3 or 4 references to it, but they all kind of reference back to one another. It's a kind of little bit of a circle jerk. I never found like a reputable source for this.
Well, they still got time.
That's right. Well, so Sliwa, not only is still a media personality, but over time has become more and more of a like a conservative talking head. He's never been a Trump supporter, but he's had syndicated shows where it's morning radio. I mean, drive time conservative morning talk radio.
He's got a following.
And now he has announced that he's running for mayor of New York City in 2021 on a platform that Bill de Blasio has abandoned the city, that what we need to do is restore that kind of old school New York faith in the cops and cleaning up the streets. There's a video of Curtis walking down the street being followed by dozens and dozens of pigeons, and he's still very fit. He's in his mid-60s.
He looks younger than his age in all these pictures.
He's handsome. He's maybe handsomer now than he was when he was younger.
You have a type.
He's still wearing that satin jacket and that red beret everywhere he goes. And I think he's pretty celebrated when he walks around the city.
Yeah, he's got kind of a grizzled Ernest Borgnine ex-Special Forces thing going on now.
But he's got all kinds of YouTube videos of himself kind of out in New York, like stirring up trouble, giving stump speeches. But my favorite is this video where he's walking down the street and he's like, everywhere I go, these pigeons follow me. And it's true. He's walking down the sidewalk and every pigeon in the area is just like landing on the ground and kind of walking along behind him in a like the rats in Ireland.
They don't vote, Curtis. Is he so we could be speaking to a future where Curtis Sliwa is we're talking about him as kind of a funny 80s relic, but in fact maybe the future knows of him as the first mayor of the New York megalopolis or something in the 21st century.
Yeah, he is. He's running as a Republican. He's not an independent. He's running for the Republican
primary
nomination.
Republicans occasionally win that race too, so it's that's not something that always gets figured out in the primary.
But in the weirdest sense, like the Guardian Angels did not franchise globally as a universally accepted and understood like fifth column of police or guardianship of our communities. But neither did they disappear in disgrace. Even more confusingly, Curtis actually was kidnapped in the 90s.
After the fake one. Oh, but now he's the boy who cried wolf.
He was kidnapped and shot multiple times.
Because of his crime-fighting activities?
So the story was he hailed a cab, got in the cab, and there was a guy in the front seat that popped up from the footwell and just started shooting at him.
Jeez.
And
that's worse than a cash cab.
Super confusingly, he reached for the door and realized that the handles had been taken out.
It's like a movie. And
so this is the part of the story I don't understand. He got out one of the front windows of the cab, but you've got a driver and a guy with a gun
shooting at you,
and somehow you get out the front window.
I wonder which window he would have chosen.
Covered in blood, but it turned out that it was John Gotti Jr.
What?
Who, furious that Curtis had badmouthed his father on his conservative talk radio show. Another like New York clown,
classic New York
clown
mistake.
car.
Never make fun of John Gotti on your morning radio show.
John Gotti Jr. had this hit put out on him, and they tried John Gotti Jr. several times for the crime and never were able to convict him. But yeah, his second kidnapping by the mob.
That's gonna win him some votes, I think.
It's a very confusing story. But somehow the guardian angels both feel like an 80s relic, also are still active. I saw a group of them in New York the last time I was there. And like in a way maybe feel even pregnant with possibility now.
Like that's the way forward?
It's hard to, I mean,
it's kind of community policing.
Sadly, when Curtis has these press conferences for his mayoral campaign, he has guardian angels standing behind him. And I think that's a terrible advertisement for the guardian angels as a neutral sort of community-based policing organization. You don't want them to be
a tool of the state.
Yeah, your paramilitary bodyguards. But in a world where you've got boogaloos on one side with AR-15s, and you've got black bloc guys, guys with the who knows, like fake Molotov cocktails, and then in the middle you've got these.
That's just Smuckers. That's not even a Molotov cocktail.
You've got these like 40-year-old like Dominican ladies in red berets who are trying to bust peepers. I mean, I'm going to go with the guardian angels every time.
And that concludes the Guardian Angels. Entry 554.EX2320. Certificate number 25639 in the omnibus. Futurelings, speaking of relics of the past, I'm not talking about Curtis Sliwa. By the way, it's weird. By the way, that there's one white guy named Curtis still in New York.
Yeah, it's Curtis. It's Curtis with a C.
Yes.
So it's not like
Curtis.
Curtis.
But maybe that gets him in. That gets him an in certain neighborhoods. Hey, Curtis is here. Which
hey,
Curtis?
Yo, Curtis.
Which Curtis? Curtis Sliwa?
It gets him an in Canarsie.
But, social media also somehow still persists. And if you're a omnibus listener in your area, you can look to see what John and I were doing in our area at John Roderick, at Ken Jennings on Twitter, and in John's case, Instagram. We are jointly at Omnibus Project. So please like, share, and subscribe, as the young people say. Look for John's TikTok.
Mm-hmm. That's where it's all happening.
Look for my Cameo. I'll tell you happy birthday for only $20,000. Oh
yeah, we were gonna start a Cameo. We talked about that. What are we gonna do? We're gonna leave people's outgoing phone messages.
Yeah. Everybody has an
hey,
answer
everybody.
machine.
Thanks for calling Cynthia. This is Ken Jennings.
You can. We're not really on Facebook, but the Futurelings are, and
Mm-hmm.
they're a lovely fan group. There are similar communities on Discord and Reddit who are probably reminiscing about Guardian Angels and or correcting us about our pronunciation right now.
Yeah, unless you are one of the very first people to have downloaded this episode and watched it, there's very little chance that if you went to Facebook right now, you wouldn't find an ongoing conversation about it, where you're already going to feel behind.
The people will be complaining about saying vigilante right
Vigilanteism.
now. You can email us if you prefer to deliver your complaints in person and not just to like-minded fellow complainers. You can email us at theomnibusproject@gmail.com. If you want to send us physical items, I'm opening a box right now and I have no idea what's in it. You can mail
It's a bomb! Ah!
A guy just jumped out of this box and says,
Happy birthday!
Best regards from John Gotti Jr. This is nice.
Wait a minute, there's a fully eaten apple core sitting there. Did you bring that, or is that something else?
That came out of the box. No, I just finished an apple.
Oh.
I always like to eat a big apple while I'm recording a podcast. I feel like the listeners...
Yeah.
No, I did it before the show. Vince is 90 days sober.
Hey, congratulations, Vince.
He thanks us for helping. I don't know why. When John mentions he helps people who are struggling, when you mentioned that on the George Bush's crack dealer show, he reached out. I don't know if you spoke to him.
Oh yeah,
but he sent us. Oh wow, this is very.
Hello.
He says he can't support the show financially right now, but he kind of is, because he sent us these lovely socks with surfing monkeys on them.
Okay. And some palm trees, right?
And this is very prescient. He sent us a little model of the Back to the Future car.
You just...
Let me shoot this over to you.
You
88
just
miles per hour.
referenced DeLorean on this very episode.
And well, he sent this months before anybody heard the DeLorean entry that we recorded recently.
Oh, this is a cool little dude.
Oh, the doors go up. Thank you so much, Vince.
Hey, Vince.
And congratulations on your new sobriety.
Yeah, one day at a time, Vince.
There was something else in the mail, but I think it was just another birthday card to you. Oh, it was, yes.
Oh.
Julie, calling herself Grandma Julie, probably not your grandma. She sent me $5 for my birthday, and she wants you to know that she sent you $6, and she hopes this gives you some ammunition in your efforts to take me down a peg or keep me in my place.
Have you noticed that there's a growing sense of, this is $6, 6 real American dollars?
I like how you were instantly derailed in your sentence by seeing a $5 bill.
Well, and I like Julie's handwriting. She has cursive handwriting in the very style that I write cursive handwriting. Like, this could be my formal handwriting. And we both...
It looks like it's taking her some effort. It's not the easiest way she could write, but she's willing to do that for you, John, on your birthday.
That's how I write cursive too. And I feel like we must have learned cursive within 10 years of one another, because this feels like a style that no longer exists. But what I was saying is, have you noticed that among the futurelings, there's now a kind of there's a subset of them that are kind of gleefully pitting us against one another, you and I?
Yeah, what's their end game?
I don't know, replying to your emails and saying, sorry, nothing for John this time. Not really interested in John's stories. Or, here's $6, John. I only gave Ken $5.
I think you've been stoking it, actually.
No.
And you want these kind of... you're trying to build a private fan base.
No.
And you're going to start putting them in red berets and members-only jackets.
No. When people are on our website and they're like, list your favorite episodes... You see all the time these people that are like, here are my top 10 episodes, and they're all your episodes.
My brother texted me yesterday to be like, hey, I liked the new Omnibus. John's wasn't any good. I was like, come on, man.
Well, was he listening to the Duc d'Anjou?
It was the Duc d'Anjou.
Because I agree.
How did you know?
I agree. That wasn't any good. By far, the episode of the Omnibus that I most feel like couldn't quite get my
But
hand
isn't it
on.
nice working in a medium where it doesn't matter if the result is any good or not? That's something I have to love about podcasting. The thing about podcasts is they exist, and that's all people want. Hey, is this thing an hour long? Okay, I'm on board.
It's not even that it's not any good as much as it is that someone out there, I guarantee you, someone out there, the Duc d'Anjou episode of Omnibus is their favorite.
That's exactly
episode.
Right. There is no consensus.
And I'm like, as the creator of that episode, let me tell you, it was a bad episode. And they're going to argue with me. No. No, it was amazing. I learned so much. I loved the sound of your voice.
It hit just right.
As you struggled to figure out who the 7th cousin of the 7th Duke was.
You do not have to send us $5 bills to support the show. I mean, we're not going to send them back, probably. But luckily, for your convenience, we have set up a Patreon for those who feel like their Omnibus experience is richer when they can keep the show on the air. If it's in your budget, you can support the show at patreon.com/omnibusproject and enjoy all the amazing perks of membership that come with that.
We really do appreciate it. And rather than send us $5 or $6 in an envelope, you can send us $5 a month, and it makes a huge difference.
It's 12 times as good every year, in my opinion.
Future links from our vantage point in your distant past, back before all law enforcement was handled by some offshoot of Curtis Sliwa's paramilitary.
It's going to be actual
groups.
Raccoons. They won't need to put the raccoon tails on their hats. It'll be little washing bears in berets with maybe human tails coming off their hats.
If order in the world were maintained by like sentient trash pandas, I would be so thrilled.
They'd be uncontroversial because they'd be so cute, and maybe that would lead to abuse.
And when they go, they're not cute. They're scary.
No, they'd rear up on their hind legs, and then the pervs on the train would stop taking their upskirt photos.
Well, we have no idea how long it will take for trash pandas to fight the army of pervs, but we hope and pray that end result comes soon. We hope and pray that the catastrophe that we fear may never come. But if the worst comes soon, this recording, like all our recordings, may have been our final word. If Providence allows, we hope to be back with you soon for another entry in the Omnibus.